मेरा रंग दे मेरा रंग दे बसंती चोला माए रंग दे मेरा रंग दे बसंती चोला माए रंग दे मेरा रंग दे बसंती चोला रंग दे
I've seen the book. It's on the table. Inquilab Zindabad, India's liberation struggle. And the topic today is India's liberation struggle 1913 to 1931 and internationalism. This is a period which is not well known, to its shame, by the British working class movement as a whole. Britain as a whole tends to think only really about the last few years of the liberation struggle and associate it with Nehru and Ghandi. And we'll learn today that the truth is actually very different. So, without further ado, I introduce you to Harpal Brar.
I think before I speak to you about the topic allotted to me, I need to tell you just very, very briefly about the Ghadar Party. Ghadar is a word which translates loosely into mutiny, and literally means a mutiny in the army. And in 1857, a widespread revolt broke out against the rule of the East India Company in India. And it was the story of the British government that it was a localized thing, it was a mutiny by some of the soldiers, and it was no more than that Indian people, by and large, were not involved in it. This is not true, and the only people who understood that, far from being confined to the army, it was a national revolt of the Indian people against the rule of the East India Company. There were two sources that accepted that. One was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who knew from the very, very early beginnings of this uprising that it was not a mutiny. And Marx says in his inimitable style, slowly but surely, the truth will ooze out, that what John Bull thinks is a mutiny is actually a national revolt of the Indian people. And to be fair to them, some very perceptive British colonialists themselves understood that it was not a mutiny, it was something far greater, and it has far more depth and breadth to it, because more than a third of Indian territory was covered by this revolt, and more than a third of the Indian population was actively or passively involved in supporting this rebellion. To our shame, there were even Marxist historians and prominent members of the Communist Party in India who thought this was the last stand of the old dying feudal classes, and it's a jolly good thing that the British were able to suppress and usher India into a modern age. That has been corrected by subsequent historiography. So it was a national revolt. But what happened was that in the beginning of the 20th century, when some Indian immigrants, mainly Punjabis and overwhelmingly Sikh, decided to form this party, they called it the Ghadar Party, because the British referred to the 1857 revolt of the Indian people contemptuously as a Ghadar, i.e. as a mutiny. And so they called themselves mutiny, to actually say, right, what you consider as a term of contempt is for us the starting point of our modern liberation struggle. This is the mutiny. Now, one of the good things about the Ghadar people was they understood two things. That if the 1857 revolt reached anywhere, it was because the British Indian Army refused to be the obedient tool that it had been built up to be by British colonialism. They deserted Britain and shook to its very foundation the rule of the East India Company and indirectly the rule of Britain over India. And so they knew that for any Indian uprising to be successful, they had to have army on their side, and working in the army and inciting the army to defect to the side of the Indian people against British colonialism was a cardinal principle with them. They understood that from the very beginning. Secondly, they understood that the 1857 revolt very nearly succeeded in throwing the British out of India. And if it didn't succeed, the major part in that failure was played by the people of Punjab, led by the feudal princes who sided with the British. After Punjab had been annexed in 1845, there were 4 Anglo-Sikh wars, they're called. And in the end, the Sikh side lost. This was after the death of Ranjit Singh, who ruled over a very vast territory in northwest India called Punjab, but it included Sindh, it included parts of Afghanistan, it included parts of Ladakh. It was a very large state. Ranjit Singh was a very competent ruler, and he was totally illiterate, but very competent. But his successes proved not to be so. And what's more, there was plenty of treachery. Anyway, the Sikhs were defeated by 1845, but they had fought very hard against the British, and it's well recorded by British as well as Indian historians. So they didn't trust the Sikhs. So they dismissed the entire army. And after 1845, within 12 years, the national revolt of the Indian people broke out. And who were the people who were rebelling against the British? The very soldiers from eastern part of India who'd been mobilized the British to overcome the Sikhs in Punjab. So basically, the British had no one to rely on. So they hurriedly went to Punjab, and the very people they dismissed, they recruited again into the army and got the support of the princes. And they were able to use the divisions by saying, these are the people who defeated you in 1845. Not led by the British, these are the people who defeated you in 1845. Isn't it the time for you to take revenge by defeating them? So that sort of thing, divide and rule, was played, and sadly it was played successfully. So the purpose of telling you this little story is to say why the Ghadarites, as they are known, the people who formed the Ghadar Party, the party of revolt, called their party the Ghadar Party as a matter of pride and honor, and they also regarded themselves that their struggle was a continuation of what had been left unfinished in 1859 when the mutiny was finally suppressed by the British. It lasted off and on 2 years, but the first year, 1857 to 58, saw the most fierce, if you like, saw the most fierce fighting. Now, when this party, again itself, is very interesting how it was formed. It was formed by Indians who had gone to North America and Canada. Yeah. It was formed by the, basically, Sikhs, but mainly Punjabis. Few Muslims, but mainly Sikhs. Almost all of them, not all, were Sikhs. And almost all of them, but not all, had been in the British Army. They had retired from the British Army, and many of them were working in the Far East, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, etc., as watchmen, as policemen employed by the British in Hong Kong and Singapore, etc. And they met there a lot of people who'd come from Canada. And they suddenly realized that for doing the same job, the Canadian worker got 10 or 12 times more than they were getting. And wouldn't it be a good idea to go to Canada? And to them, British Empire was one whole. It didn't matter which part of the empire you were in. You were the subjects of His Majesty or Her Majesty, as the case may be, and you were therefore protected, and you had a right to work anywhere. The whole idea of color and discrimination didn't just enter into their minds. They ended up in Canada and America, and what do they find? Everybody hates the sight of them, for no other reason than they're black. Sometimes, of course, it was exacerbated by the fact that capitalism has its inevitable economic crisis. Whenever there was a question of unemployment, there could always be found some white politician who is inciting the whites against the blacks, saying they're taking your jobs. These are the defenders of capitalism who, instead of pointing out that unemployment and crisis of overproduction are inherent to capitalism, kept on saying they are taking your jobs. They were inciting people. So they got a lot of discrimination. What's more, to add to it so that not many of them would turn up, they brought in all kinds of rules in Canada to prevent the Indians from traveling to Canada. They wouldn't let the families join. They would ask that each person coming in must have a surety or security deposited against every woman, man and child coming in of $200. Now you're talking of early 20th century, when $200 was a lot of things. I know it doesn't buy ice cream these days, but it was a lot of money. They didn't have the money. And even when they had the money, they brought in another rule, because the Sikhs very early on, this is what immigrant communities do, they establish a religious place. It's not because they're particularly devoted and devout and they want to pray to God or whoever, it may be. It is because these are meeting places, they're social places where they can gather together. So they had a temple, and sometimes the temple people say, we'll put up the money. Now this really creates a problem, because your rule is beaten, because they can find the money. And some of the early Sikhs bought themselves farms, bought small businesses, bought some properties, and by the early 10s, they had properties worth $300,000, which is a lot of property. So a new rule was brought, that anyone arriving from India to Canada must arrive by a continuous, unbroken journey. But there was no shipping line that operated between Indian ports and the Canadian ports. You had to go via Thailand, Singapore, or Hong Kong. Couldn't do it. So there's one enterprising Sikh who had a very thriving business in Singapore. He threw all of it away. His name was Gurdit Singh. He had a Japanese ship called Kamagata, issued tickets to 372 or 76 different books of different accounts, and off they sailed. And when they reached Vancouver Harbour, they were denied entry. And the Canadian authorities tried to send the police, but the people on board this Japanese boat beat them off. They even tried to bring a warship, and the Canadian press got hold of it. And they said, what is the Canadian government up to? To actually use a warship against half-starved Indians on board this boat. So that had to be put off. And in the end, an agreement was reached whereby the Indians said they would depart themselves after 8 weeks standoff, they'll come back, provided they were given proper medical supplies and provisions. So they came back. And when they came back, they reached Calcutta. And as they come off the boat, there's the British police, Indians, of course led by white officials. They're shot at, and several dozen are killed at Budge in Calcutta. Now these people, when they went to Canada, had no political ideas. They really regarded themselves as genuine servants of the British Crown, who boasted the fact that they had won for Britain such and such territories. They'd beaten the Chinese, they'd killed so many Chinese, they'd done all the rest of it. And this experience of theirs, although they had no connection with the Ghadar Party at that time, Ghadar Party had been formed about a year before that, but they had no connection. But when they're coming back from Canada, the representatives of the Ghadar Party meet them at various ports, particularly in Japan, and are able to give them some weapons and literature. And that's the first time they come into contact with Ghadar. But basically, whether these people on this boat were connected with the Ghadar Party or not, the Ghadar Party gets its sustenance basically from racial discrimination practiced against them and the horrendous conditions that they faced over there. They were not political people. They got they got politicized thanks to the British colonial authorities in India, in Canada, and in Britain, acting as recruiting sergeants for people's transformation from being loyal subjects into impeccable foes of British colonialism and imperialism. That's what happened with that. Now, I've given you this background, I think, in my opinion, those who didn't know it needed it. I now concentrate on the topic which is given to me, which is the internationalism of the Ghadar Party. There are 3 subjects on which I want to touch. If I run out of my 50 minutes, then I'll stop after 1 or 2, as the case may be. The first topic that I want to really connect the Ghadarites to on the question of internationalism is the Ghadar Party and the October Revolution. Nothing in human history has happened before or since which is comparable to the October Revolution. It is a revolution which changed the face of humanity. And notwithstanding the tremendous reverses and setbacks suffered by socialism over the last 25 years, thanks to the ravages caused by Khrushchevite revisionism, the world cannot be put back into the position in it which was prior to 7th of November 1970. Even people who are backward, even people who have a very backward social outlook, their vision is changed, and in places like Afghanistan and Iraq can defeat imperialism because the world is a post-October 1917 world. So the October Revolution had a tremendous and electrifying effect on people all over the world. To the proletarians in the center of imperialism, it told, you too, like the Russian proletariat, can change your life and change it immeasurably by following the example of the October Revolution and have a revolution and become the masters of your own country, of your economy, of your society, of its morals, of its education, of its health system. To the colonized people, it had an even more of an appeal. It told them, by freeing its own subject peoples, by renouncing all treaties that had been concluded by Tsarist Russia along with other imperialist powers to carve up the world into spheres of influence. It had renounced all its rights against oppressed peoples, be they in China, be they in Iran, be they in Afghanistan or anywhere. So everywhere people thought, here are our friends. Here is an imperialist country that, having made a revolution, is actually extending the hand of friendship to us. And all the colonial people who had any wits about them grasped this hand with great eagerness and alacrity. And it was in this context that the Ghadarites did. And of course, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had always believed, long before the revolution, in a close alliance between the proletariat of the imperialist countries and the oppressed peoples of the world, because they were not two separate people. They were part of the same struggle against imperialism for bringing down imperialism and ushering in the era of world proletarian revolution. Already in the first week of March 1920, Lenin made the important statement in which he said, among other things, that the Indians, and I cite him, all look towards one star, the star of the Soviet Republic, because they know that it made tremendous sacrifices in order to fight the imperialists and that it has witnessed the most severe trials. Even before Lenin made the statement, a month earlier, the Indian Revolutionary Association, which was operating from Kabul, one of the internationalism of the Ghadarites is, they had branches all over the place. Obscure places, like Panama. I wouldn't call Argentina obscure, but Panama is certainly. In Panama, in Argentina, in Mexico. Would you believe that the Mexican Communist Party was formed by an Indian called M.N. Roy? So they were all over the place, in Thailand, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Japan, etc. And then the Kabul Association had passed a resolution in which it expressed its deep gratitude and admiration of the great struggle carried on by Russia for the liberation of all the oppressed classes and peoples, and especially for the liberation of India. It expressed great thanks to the Soviet Russia, for it had heeded the cries of 315 million, that was the population of India, United India then, Indians suffering under the jackboot of British imperialism, and accepted with joy the hand of friendship and help extended to oppressed India. Few weeks later, on 10th of May 1920, Lenin, having noticed this statement, and nothing escaped his eye. I mean, you meet people in our movement, they're doing nothing. You try and write a letter to them, you never get an acknowledgement. Right? Lenin is managing the Soviet state in the middle of civil war and war of intervention. And he has the time to respond to this. And in this, he said how glad he was that the principles of self-determination and liberation of the oppressed nations from exploitation by foreign and native capitalists proclaimed by the workers and peasants of the Republic had met with such ready response among progressive Indians who were waging a heroic fight for freedom. The organization and discipline of the working people and their perseverance and solidarity, he said, was an earnest of ultimate success, and he expressed the sincere desire to help in building a close alliance between the toilers of the East. So, from the very beginning of the Soviet Republic, Indians in North America and the Ghadarites, the leading elements in them, they were the most politically advanced element of Indian society, albeit living abroad. They were far more radical than the people living in India at that time. And a prominent Ghadarite, I won't try and ask you to remember his name, Taraknath Das, he wrote that in the paper of the Ghadarites. Ghadarites produced several papers. The most famous is the very first paper. They called it Ghadar, Mutiny, Revolt. But then, as happens with small organizations, papers go into extinction and new papers are started. But they never were without a paper for a very long time. They understood from the very beginning that without an organ, without a political propagandist in writing, they could not proceed further. So they produced newspapers. And by this time, they had a newspaper called Independent Hindustan. And it might be of interest to you that the Hindustan Times of India today was started by the Ghadarites and sold to the Birla family at some stage. So the Ghadarites were pro-Soviet revolution. And Taraknath Das is writing in January 21, he says, imperialist Russia is gone. Revolutionary Russia is avowedly an enemy of imperialism in any form. She has given up her spheres of influence and extraterritorial rights in China. She has championed the cause of Persian, Egyptian, Turkish and Indian independence. She recognized the Irish Republic. She has entered into friendly relations with Afghanistan. And I can assure you that one of the principal reasons for the waging of the war against Russia has been Britain's fear that Soviet Russia will inspire and unite the Indian people to destroy the British Empire. Because even in Tsarist times, India was very important to them. You have heard of the story of the Great Game, which was played between Tsarist Russia and British colonialism and imperialism. They were constantly worried that Tsarist Russia will take over India. I wish it had taken over, because with the October Revolution we would have got liberation as well, but that was not to be, So here is a sort of going back into history and siding with one imperialism against the other, if you like. Okay. So, and of course the Ghadarites had to be very careful, because they had come out of the San Francisco conspiracy trial, which was waged against them by the American government and at the instigation of the British government. They'd come through the war where Britain and America were allies, and of course the October Revolution has taken place, and the leader by this time, decidedly, of the anti-communist crusade leadership is being taken over by America from Britain. So anybody writing in favor of Russia had to be very, very careful, but they nevertheless did their job. And being exhilarated and enthused by the Soviet stance in the fight against British imperialism, the Ghadar Party realized the necessity of establishing direct contact with Moscow. It's no point writing just editorials, must be a direct contact. And so they sent the leader of the editor of Independent Hindustan, somebody called Surendranath Kar, to Moscow. He's a brilliant guy. Unfortunately, he died very early in 1922. But what he did was, before he died, he paved the way for the travel of other Ghadarites to Soviet Russia. And also, and the two first people who were to go there were very well-known Ghadarites, one called Santokh Singh and the other one called Ratan Singh. They received an invitation from the Communist International to travel to Soviet Russia. Meanwhile, one of the other things, and this brings me to the remark that was made by Comrade Kenna during the discussions in the last Stalin Society meeting. The Comintern and the Soviet Union had established in 1921 a university called University of the Toilers of the East. And its function was to invite revolutionaries from all over the eastern countries, principally Asia, to come to Russia and actually learn something about how Soviet Russia was functioning and how they could be given lessons. A lot of these countries ruled by colonialism did not even have access to proper books. Marxist literature was banned. You could get it, Capitalism can never completely succeed in blocking all access to information. And even those days, with draconian measures, British capitalism wasn't able to succeed. So you could find Russian literature. As Lenin said, the Bolshevik bacillus would penetrate all the iron walls that are erected to keep it out. And sure enough, it did. And responding to this invitation, Santokh Singh and Ratan Singh traveled to Soviet Russia, where they attended the fourth Congress of the Comintern, which took place between the 5th of November and 5th of December 1922. Santokh Singh attended as a delegate, and his comrade attended as an observer. And you would remember from your own studies that at the fourth Congress, the most prominent question discussed was the colonial question, the national and colonial question, where Lenin's thesis on the national and colonial question was accepted as being correct. And there the delegates, coming from everywhere, but especially from the East, were told to build in their countries anti-imperialist and anti-feudal democratic revolutionary organizations and work for an anti-feudal and anti-imperialist program. Also, they were told, yes, you must make alliances with the bourgeoisie of your country, but you must also be very aware of the inconsistency of the national bourgeoisie. It can be an ally, a transient ally. You must take advantage of any opportunity to make an alliance and to spread the influence of your movement, but you mustn't rely, because the bourgeoisie can do the dirty anytime, because its selfish interests propel it to break away from the working class. They were told to maintain their independence within the national liberation movement. Ratan Singh and Santokh Singh stayed 6 months in Soviet Russia, where, although there's no firm evidence, they are likely to have attended the University of the Toilers of the East. I mean, the Comintern would see to it. They didn't invite you to just go around and look at St. Basil's Church in the Kremlin. You know, they gave you education. And if they attended it, the same education would be given to them as would be given to anyone who ever entered the premises of that university. Namely, they were given lessons in political economy, they were taught about historical materialism, they were taught about the strategy and tactics of proletarian revolution, and they were taught about how to build a communist party. Sometimes they were even given lessons in guerrilla warfare. You know, so everything was there. There's a wide-ranging menu. You couldn't choose. You had to have everything. You came from one class to another. And I'll come to that point later. Many of the Indians who went there, overwhelming majority, were illiterate. Never mind English, they could not write in Punjabi either. And it's to the credit of their teachers in Moscow that they taught them in their language. Their teachers spoke and knew very well Punjabi, Hindi, Urdu, Persian, and a number of other languages. And there was not a bit of racial arrogance towards them displayed as would be displayed in Indian schools towards Indian students if they ever got a chance to be taught by a British teacher, which would only be in select private schools, not ordinary schools. They stayed 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, they opted to come to India. And in Kabul, Santokh Singh and Ratan Singh decided that while Santokh Singh will proceed to India and start the revolutionary movement, Ratan Singh will operate from Kabul and anywhere else. Santokh Singh reached India. He was arrested as soon as he entered India. He was kept in jail for 2 years, tortured, beaten, and released. And as soon as he was released, he started a newspaper in Punjabi called Kirti, which means the worker. That newspaper played a significant role in the development of the communist movement in Punjab. And you heard Ella's talk on Agnes Smedley. And sadly, Santokh Singh did not live very long. He died shortly afterwards due to the then fatal disease called tuberculosis. I mean, you don't even consider it as a serious disease now, but in the 30s, it was a big killer. And he produced a newspaper, and the first issue came in February 26. Obviously, the reach the news of this publication reached Soviet Russia a bit late. So in February 1928, almost 2 years after the first issue came out, Pravda greeted the publication. And I cite the words of Pravda. Good news from Punjab. They have a paper of their own to organize the peasants. So alarmed was the London Times that it reproduced the Pravda report in full. And the Indian government, of course, the British Indian government was alarmed at that. At the prospect that Soviet Russia was successful in establishing relations, as they called the turbulent Sikhs. As a result of this, the paper Kirti has come out according to the British intelligence report. There was a big spy chief working in the British intelligence called Sir David Petrie, Petri. He wrote in his report, the establishment of the Sikh communist paper. It wasn't a Sikh communist paper, it was an Indian communist paper, albeit headed by a person who happened to be a Sikh. I mean, these people didn't regard themselves as Hindus or Sikhs or any such thing. And also, if you read the literature of that time, all Indians were called Hindus. Because Hindu at that time was not a religious word, it was just Indians were called Hindus, whether they were Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, whoever they were. And he said the establishment of the Sikh communist paper was sufficient to show, wrote Sir David, that Moscow's effort to sow the seeds of Bolshevism among the disaffected Sikhs, and not just the Sikhs, but all Indians, in India had not altogether been unsuccessful. And he went on to characterize the paper as strongly revolutionary and communist. Santokh Singh died in May 1927 of TB, as I said before. Meanwhile, in America, financial difficulties had resulted in the closure for a short time of the independent Hindustan. And very shortly afterwards, the Ghadarites brought another paper, which is constantly referred to. They called it the United States of India. They called it the United States of India because they were revolutionary Democrats who wanted to establish a democratic republic on the line that the Americans had established after their liberation from British colonialism, with suitable changes and adaptations to adapt to the Indian conditions of life. The coming out of this United States of India, USI as I call it, happened to coincide with the wonderful news coming from Soviet Russia that Soviet Union was winning the war against the internal counter-revolutionaries and against the foreign imperialist-led interventionist forces. And the United States of India supported first the anti-imperialist movements all over the world, not just in India, but all over the world. It refuted British lies about colonial peoples all over the world. It condemned repression, oppression, and exploitation of Indian masses by their British rulers. It exposed the imperialist character of British conservative and, mind you, Labour governments, but of British conservative and, capital and, Labour governments. It informed the Indian masses about the freedom movement of the Chinese people and the unity of the struggle of the Indian people and those of China, Ireland, and Egypt. And it supported Soviet Russia, of course, goes without saying. In 1924, Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government took office. And to actually show its imperialist credentials, it brutally suppressed a strike of 150,000 Bombay textile workers, shooting down several hundred of them in cold blood and staging the notorious Kanpur conspiracy trial. So, and the USI exposed the imperialist nature of the British Labour government, saying there was no difference between the preceding Conservative administration and the Labour government that had taken over. While the British working class and its self-appointed representatives in the various communist parties, apart from mine, continue not to understand this question even now, the Indian Ghadarites, backward though they might be regarded because they were from a colonial country and did not have the degrees from Oxford and Cambridge or even Hull right? They understood this question exceptionally well. Of course, one of the things that the British did very well was to divide people. You know, like they will incite one color of people against another. The British did that among the Hindus and Muslims in India. And the purpose was to weaken the Indian liberation movement, but there was a second purpose. Soviet Russia was on the scene to keep people engrossed with religion and religious conflict so much that they will not make contact with Soviet Russia and would not be influenced by the developments, earth-shaking developments that were taking place in that part of the world and having ramifications elsewhere. There was always a close friendship between the Irish revolutionaries and Indian revolutionaries. And you would forgive me for giving you this quotation from the Irish World, which was a paper published from Philadelphia on the question of riots in India. It's not directly concerned with internationalism, but it is because the Irish revolutionaries are here coming to the rescue of the Indians. And the writer in this case is Lord Oliver, who had been Secretary of State for India. When he was discussing the Indian situation in London Times the other day, let that one substantial cat out of the bag. He admitted that British officialdom in India showed a distinct bias for Muslims against the Hindus. Everybody knew the fact, but it's good to have it admitted on the word of a British ex-Secretary of State for India. Excuse me. It's simply a repetition of what occurred in Ireland. The Muslim in India, like the Protestant in Ireland, is a minority. British loves the Muslim, not for himself, but because he can be used to hold the Hindu majority in thraldom while both Hindu and Muslim are fleeced. This is exactly what happened in Ireland. The orange minority are used to keep the whole nation too weak to withstand British exploitation. And carried on in the Irish world, we can now understand why there are religious riots in so many great cities and why Indian police so frequently fire on the mob. In time, we shall find it was Britain who subsidized pogromists, as they did in Ireland, pogromists of India, who paid the men who today violate a Hindu temple and tomorrow desecrate a Muslim mosque in order to fan into foul fury the religious passions of both sects. When that has been achieved, nicely calculated fire by the British police can throw a whole city into rioting. It's a terrible picture, but it's a true one. Well, despite the tremendous resources at the disposal of British imperialism, they were unable either to halt the rise in the Indian liberation movement, nor were they in a position to prevent contact being well and truly established between Indian revolutionaries and Soviet Russia. The very presence of the Soviet Republic, even if the Bolsheviks did nothing to help anybody, the very presence of the Soviet Republic actually was a challenge to all imperialism, but especially British imperialism, which ruled over a very vast colonial empire. And within this vast empire, India was decidedly the jewel in the crown. I mean, if you actually notice, every year Britain fleeced the equivalent in modern terms of about 1,000 billion pounds. That's what happened. And India paid for all Britain's wars for conquest of other countries. Whenever a foreign visitor visited Britain, the bill was sent to the Secretary of State for India, which was run on the basis of the money fleeced from the poor Indian peasantry and the Indian vassals. So it carried on like that. So India was extremely important, and it was well understood that the ruling classes in Britain would be driven into a frenzy at the very thought of the Bolsheviks provoking a revolution in India and other colonial countries as a means of destroying the British Empire, undermining her prosperity, and thus preparing the ground for making Britain itself ripe for communism. Now, when we raise the question in Britain, and we raise Lenin's thesis on the economic basis of opportunism, a lot of communists in the imperialist countries get very annoyed with us. They tell us, so you're accusing the workers of being bribed. I said, no, I don't have a dispute with you, comrade. Your dispute is with Lenin. You can argue with him. But I just happen to agree with him. So, if you are a Leninist disagreeing with Lenin, well, you sort out your dispute. It's not my dispute with you. But this is true. How is the prevalence and strength of opportunism in the imperialist countries to be accounted for, if not by the economic basis, that a portion of the super profits extracted by the imperialist bourgeoisie, on top of the profits they get from exploiting their own ruling class, are gained from the foreign countries and handed over to privileged sections of the working class. And sometimes the whole populations, the facilities we have here. A middle-class Indian would love to have those facilities available to him. Wonderful library, even if they're closing, swimming pools, health system, etc. With all, I know you have criticism that everything is disappearing, but it hasn't yet disappeared. All that is available, and that is really the base opportunism. And if colonial loot was to stop, if India and other countries were to slip away from the grip of imperialism, it would destroy Britain's prosperity, and it will take away the basis for the British ruling class, not only ruling over the colonies, but also over their own proletariat. Now, this was well understood by the intelligent representatives of the British ruling class, if not always by the communists. So the Ghadarites succeeded after Santokh Singh and Ratan Singh in actually sending quite a number of people to Soviet Russia. And it's a little side story I want to tell you. One of the young Ghadarites, only 25 years old, was somebody called Prem Singh Gill. He came from a place called Faridkot. I have, of course, a special affinity with Faridkot. And he had gone to a private school in India. He studied for 2 years medical science in Lahore. He went to California and did a degree in science. And at 25, he's sent by the Ghadar Party to Soviet Russia. His special interest was in the tanning industry. Tanning, yeah? Tanning. And because he was such an expert, he was taken into the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He married a Soviet woman. He represented Soviet science at various international conferences. But sadly, at the age of 36, in 1936, he died again of TB. But it just shows you how welcoming the Soviet Union was towards anybody who could help the Soviet Union progress. There was no arrogance, you're an Indian, what are you doing in the Soviet Academy of Social Sciences? Go and clean the lavatories at Leningrad or something. No, they didn't. They looked after people and used their talents. I want to make a little digression here. It's not really a digression. One of the big and prominent Ghadarites who incidentally was a Muslim, called Barkatullah. Now, Barkatullah was not a communist, but he was a fierce anti-imperialist revolutionary nationalist. He traveled to the Soviet Union in the spring of 1919. And on 7th of May 1919, he met Lenin and left a very favorable impression on Lenin. And he became a crusader for the triumph of the October Revolution through pamphlets, leaflets, and fiery speeches. Before reaching Petrograd and Moscow, he had been in Tashkent, which is the capital of Uzbekistan. And he wrote, while he was there, an appeal, to which I will cite you in full in a minute. But when he came to Soviet Russia, he gave an interview to Petrograd Pravda, in which he said, I'm not a communist or a socialist, but my political program at the present is the expulsion of the English from Asia. To Indians, all British are English. In fact, more than that, at that time, all Europeans were English. That's the only Europeans we knew, so everybody was called English. And even as erudite and incisive a person as Engels is writing about the whole of Britain, and he writes his book, what? The Condition of Working Class in England. Okay? So this is a common, misapprehension that we all foreigners share, whether we are from Germany or from Britain. So I'm not a communist or a socialist, but my political program at the present is the expulsion of the English from Asia. I'm an irreconcilable enemy of European capital in Asia, whose main representative is the English. In this, I concur with the communists, and in this respect, we are genuine allies. Specifically referring to the Bolshevik program concerning the right of self-determination, he concluded his interview with the Petrograd Pravda by saying, I only know one thing, that the well-known appeal of Soviet government of Russia to all peoples, calling upon them to struggle against capitalism, and for us, capitalist is synonymous for the foreigner, more accurately, the Englishman. Calling upon them to struggle against capitalism has created on us colossal impression. Even bigger impression was produced by the annulment by Russia of all secret treaties imposed by imperialist governments and the proclamation of the rights of peoples, however small they may be, to self-determination. That act united around Soviet Russia all the exploited peoples of Asia and all parties. Even parties far removed from socialism, these acts predetermined and brought near the Asian Revolution. You see, how can you stop Bolshevik influence when you oppress colonial people and the Bolsheviks are saying, we want you to be free, we want you to have self-determination, we want you, if you want to join with us, join on equal terms as our partners, as many former Russian Tsarist colonies joined the Soviet Republic on an equal basis. So words speak louder, the deeds speak louder than words. What the Soviet Revolution was doing was demonstrating in practice the vitality of the working class policy towards colonial people, and that's what was bothering imperialists so much. And at that time, Soviet Russia engaged in a mortal struggle against national internal counter-revolution and imperialist intervention, and Barkatullah therefore plunged himself into the work of mobilizing Muslims all over the world, especially Soviet Muslims, onto the side of the Soviet Republic. His appeal is worth listening to, even if you find it a bit long. This is what he said in his appeal, which he had written in Tashkent. Time has come for Mohammedans of the world and Asiatic nations to understand the noble principles of Russian socialism and to embrace it seriously and enthusiastically. They should fathom and realize the cardinal virtues taught by the new system, and in defense of the true freedom, they should join the Bolshevik troops in repelling attacks of usurpers and despots, the British. Addressing the Muslims directly, the appeal continued, O Mohammedans, listen to the divine cry. Remember, he's a devout Muslim. Listen to the divine cry. Respond to his, God's call, of liberty, equality, and brotherhood, which Comrade Lenin and Soviet government of Russia are offering to you. O Muslim residents of Russia and all Eastern countries, we are announcing to you that the secret treaties made between the deposed Emperor Tsar and other states, i.e. the occupation of Constantinople, as well as treaties ratified by the dismissed Kerensky government, have been annulled and torn up. The Russian Soviets and their government, i.e. the Assembly of National Representatives, have forbidden conquest of foreign countries. We also announced that the treaty regarding the partition of Prussia is also torn up and destroyed, and as soon as war stops, the Soviet government of Russia will withdraw its troops from the Prussian soil to enable Prussians to protect their rights and form a government of their own will and desire. We also announced that the treaty regarding the division of Ottoman territories and separation of Armenia from Ottoman Empire is similarly torn up and destroyed. After the war, Armenia will be given power to form a government for themselves according to their own choice. O brethren, you should not recoil from the Russian nation and the present government of Russia. You should rather shun those savage wolves of Europe who stand ready to conquer countries and enslave peoples, who have usurped your homes and hearts and turned them into their own colonies. These infamous wolves and shameless usurpers who are occupying homes should be driven out. And so it carried on. Now you must say that coming from a non-communist, anti-imperialist, these are very stirring words which I would not be ashamed to repeat. He then didn't stop there. At risk to his life, and during the Civil War, he made several tours of the Eastern republics of the Soviet Union, risking his life and delivering fiery speeches to rouse the masses to defend Soviet power by driving out the forces of its enemies. After a 3-year stay in 1922, he left Russia. The Ghadarites, having established branches and responding to the call of the Communist International, sent dozens of reliable revolutionaries to Soviet Russia, and 5 batches came from Argentina alone, including the father of one of our comrades in Birmingham. And believe it or not, one of the Ghadarites was somebody called Teja Singh Sultantar. He goes to Soviet Russia. He not only lectures in Punjabi to fellow Punjabis there, he also translated into the Punjabi language Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and Lenin's appeal to the village poor. Now, these are very important. Lenin's appeal to the village poor could be read anywhere in the world where there are village poor. And I've already indicated, I won't go over it, how good the teaching conditions were. And people respected their teachers because they bothered to learn their language. They bothered to learn something about the culture of their students, about their national background, about the history of those countries. And one of them was Alexei Dyakov, who became an expert on Indian questions. And he knew dozen languages, including Punjabi, Hindi, Urdu. Not all Indians can claim to know these 3 languages. Okay? And 2 of the students at the University of the Toilers of the East were lucky enough to attend the 7th and what turned out to be the last Congress of the Comintern in 1935. And they would have rubbed shoulders there with such giants as Joseph Stalin, Ho Chi Minh, Walter Ulbricht, and Wilhelm Pieck of Germany, Clement Gottwald of Czechoslovakia, Khalid Bagdash of Syria now, Rajni Pamdat, Harry Pollitt from Britain, and Maurice Torres from France, and Palmiro Togliatti from Italy. So on their return to India, and most of them offered to return to India, when they finished their courses at University of the Toilers of the East, they were asked by the Comintern and by the Soviet government, do you want to go back to the country you came from, or do you want to go to India? And be it said in their honor, overwhelming majority of them opted to go to India, although they were literally going into the enemy's den. And they played a tremendous role in the development of the communist movement in India. When they went there, then, of course, during the Second World War, their slogan was victory to the Soviet Union and defeat to Nazi Germany. They formed an organization called the Friends of the Soviet Union. They even formed a theatre group which continues to exist today, Indian People's Theatre Association, IPTA it's called, which staged progressive, communist and anti-imperialist plays. And at the end of the Second World War, of course, before that, the USSR helped the Indian revolutionaries in several ways. But the greatest contribution made by the Soviet Union to Indian liberation struggle was the defeat of Nazi Germany, which ended up by not only strengthening the Soviet Union, but bringing into existence a whole block of socialist countries in Eastern Europe, and joined 4 or 5 years later by that giant revolutionary country, People's Republic of China, People's Republic of Korea, of course, and the North Korean had already come into existence in 1945, Vietnam, etc. These countries joined. And of course, it so weakened European imperialism, especially British imperialism, it was not possible in the aftermath of the Second World War to carry on oppressing and ruling over India. So the British had to come to a compromise arrangement and leave the country. Thus, you can see, at the end of my brief introduction, there was a very close connection between the Ghadarites and the October Revolution, that in the hour of need of the Indian revolutionaries, Soviet Russia helped them everywhere. But it must also be said, in the hour of need of the Soviet Union, the Ghadarite revolutionaries helped Soviet Russia by propaganda and by any activity that they could undertake in order to support Soviet Russia. We all know about the dockers in Britain not loading the Jolly George with ammunitions, going for the Eastern Front to wage war against Soviet Russia. But hardly anybody, let alone here, in India knows what the Ghadarites did. And it's a part of history which is not a little nook of India. It's a history of the working class revolutionary movement which needs to be learned, which needs to be known, and I think there's a great deal to be learned from that friendship between the Ghadarites and the Soviet Republic. So that brings to an end the first thing I want to talk to you. Now I can actually neatly end here and another day speak to you about Ireland as well as about China. I think it'd be better because you'll be tired. If I go on to those two, it's going to take me long and it just I think spoil it. Let's just end here and another time I'll be very happy to talk about it.
बसंती चोला माए रंग दे मेरा रंग दे बसंती चोला रंग दे रंग दे रंग दे बसंती चोला माए रंग दे